In a world that too often overlooks the quiet strength of those who stand in the shadows, this is the story of Ethan Brown and his father, Malcolm Brown, a retired black firefighter whose unwavering love and courage turned a single graduation day into a moment of truth and triumph. Faced with whispered judgments and the cold stares of his mother's family, Ethan walks across the polished marble floors of the university auditorium with his father by his side, determined to honor the man who taught him what it truly means to be brave. As the echoes of an unexpected name ripple through the room, secrets once buried in silence rise to the surface, and the quiet hero the world had chosen to ignore finally steps into the light. This is a story of dignity, of resilience, and of a bond stronger than blood. A story that will remind you that sometimes the greatest victories are not won in the roar of applause, but in the quiet acts of love that change the world forever. If this story touches your heart, share it with someone you care about. Leave a comment to let us know how it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the strength and beauty of everyday heroes. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high arched windows of the grand university auditorium, turning the marble floors into rivers of gold and warming the heavy velvet curtains that framed the stage. For Ethan Brown, standing tall in his graduation gown with its navy and silver tassel swaying softly, the moment was meant to be one of triumph, of long-anticipated celebration, but it felt instead like a test of patience. His polished black shoes clicked softly against the marble, each step a reminder of how far he had come, and how much further he still had to go. Beside him stood his father, Malcolm Brown, a man whose quiet dignity seemed to draw every flicker of light in the room. Malcolm's skin was the rich, deep brown of earth after rain, his broad shoulders filling out a navy blazer that had seen better days, but which he wore with the same quiet pride he had worn his uniform as a firefighter all those years ago. His hands, resting easily at his sides, bore the faint scars of a lifetime spent in service to others, each line and ridge a testament to the fires he had fought and the lives he had saved. Around them, the low hum of conversation swirled, punctuated by bursts of laughter that never quite reached the eyes of those who offered it. Ethan could feel the weight of every glance, the way people's eyes slid over him and then settled on Malcolm, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to something colder, sharper. A reminder that no matter how high he rose, there were still those who would never see him as anything more than a black boy in a borrowed suit, standing in a place they believed did not belong to him. But Ethan had learned long ago not to let those looks define him. He stood a little taller, his chin lifting just slightly as he scanned the sea of white faces and saw, in the corner of the room, the Crowley family gathered like a silent jury. Their pearls and pressed collars gleamed in the soft light, their eyes cool and assessing as they whispered behind the rims of crystal flutes filled with sparkling cider. Ethan knew what they saw when they looked at him. The boy whose mother had married a man beneath her station. The boy who carried the burden of skin that didn't match their polished world. But he also knew who he was, who Malcolm had taught him to be. And he would not let their narrow vision steal this moment from him. He thought back to the nights when Malcolm would come home from long shifts at the firehouse, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes still warm with the soft light of love. He remembered how Malcolm's hands, rough and calloused from years of gripping hoses and axes, had held him gently when the nightmares came, had guided him through the world with a patience that never wavered, never faltered. Malcolm had taught him that true strength was not in the roar of a crowd or the gleam of a medal, but in the quiet acts of kindness that stitched the fabric of their lives together. And in this moment, as the chancellor's voice rose in the air, welcoming the graduates and their families, Ethan knew that every step he took across that stage was a testament to the man beside him, the man who had given him the courage to stand here with his head held high. Around them, the music swelled, and Ethan felt a small, fierce smile tug at the corner of his lips. This was his day, and no matter what anyone else saw when they looked at him, he knew the truth. He was not here in spite of Malcolm. He was here because of him. Would you like me to continue rewriting part 2 in this same style with the main character as Ethan? Let me know. The Chancellor's words rose and fell like waves, echoing through the vast hall as name after name was called, but Ethan felt as if the world had narrowed down to the steady, reassuring presence of Malcolm at his side. Each time the applause surged, he felt the tremor in the air, the brief flickers of attention, that never quite settled on them, always moving past, as if they were simply shadows at the edges of someone else's triumph. Yet Malcolm stood unwavering, his posture straight, his chin lifted just enough to suggest a quiet pride that refused to be hidden away. For as long as Ethan could remember, Malcolm had been his anchor in a world that often felt too loud, too sharp-edged to navigate alone. He had been the one to hold Ethan's hand the first time he stepped onto a school bus, the one who taught him how to swim in the community pool long after the other fathers had packed up their lawn chairs and left. He had been the one to stand in the cold metal bleachers at every high school game, his applause loud and steady, no matter how many points Ethan's team had lost by. And in every memory, there was that same quiet dignity, that unspoken promise that no matter what the world might see when they looked at them, no matter how small or invisible they tried to make him, Malcolm would always be there. Ethan's mother's family, the Crowleys, had never understood that kind of love. He could see it in their eyes even now, the faint crease in Aunt Eleanor's brow as she watched Malcolm from across the room, her lips pursed in a line of polite disapproval. They saw Malcolm as a man who had taken something from them, a place at the table, a piece of a legacy they believed belonged only to them. But Ethan knew better. He knew that Malcolm had never asked for anything but the chance to stand beside him, to walk through the world together, even if that world had been built to keep them both at arm's length. As the ceremony moved on, Ethan let his gaze drift over the heads of the crowd, catching the glint of cell phone screens and the bright flash of cameras, and he felt a sudden wave of gratitude for the man who had never once needed to be in the spotlight to know his own worth. Malcolm's hands were folded loosely in front of him, his thumb absently tracing the edge of his ring finger in a gesture Ethan had learned to recognize, a small grounding motion that meant he was thinking, remembering, holding steady against the weight of the past. There had been so many times when Ethan had watched those hands at work, gripping the wheel of their old truck as they drove through summer storms, folding gently around a cup of coffee in the quiet hours of dawn, steadying a ladder as he fixed a broken light on the porch. They were hands that had built a life for them out of nothing but patience and grit, hands that had carried the weight of other people's lives when the world turned to ash and smoke. And in that moment, as the Chancellor's voice rose once more to announce the next name, Ethan felt a fierce, quiet pride bloom in his chest. Whatever the world chose to see when they looked at Malcolm, he knew the truth. His father was a man of quiet valor, of quiet love, and he was here, today, always, to stand beside him. The ceremony continued, each name a ripple across the surface of the room, but for Ethan, the noise of it all seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the steady beat of his own heart and the soft, reassuring cadence of his father's breathing beside him. Malcolm stood with the same quiet strength he always carried, a kind of dignity that no threadbare blazer or second-hand shoes could diminish. And as Ethan watched him, he felt the threads of their shared history weaving themselves into something stronger, something unbreakable. He remembered the long nights when Malcolm had come home from the firehouse, his boots heavy with ash, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a world that never seemed to notice the way he carried it. Ethan had been just a boy then, small and uncertain, in a world that seemed too large for him to navigate alone. But Malcolm's presence had been like a steady flame in the darkness, a quiet promise that no matter how loud the world grew, he would always have someone to come home to. Those memories wrapped around him now, as comforting and solid as the feel of Malcolm's shoulder against his own. He thought of the times Malcolm had taught him to ride a bike, his broad hands gentle on Ethan's back as he wobbled and fell and tried again, always with Malcolm's calm encouragement in his ear. He thought of the long hours spent together in the cramped kitchen of their small apartment, the smell of burnt toast and coffee filling the air, as Malcolm taught him how to make eggs just the way he liked them, patient and unhurried, even when the world outside seemed to spin faster with each passing day. Around them, the Crowleys sat with their backs straight and their voices low, their laughter carefully modulated to fill the spaces between applause without ever truly touching the edges of the room. Ethan could feel the weight of their gaze on him, the unspoken question that had hung between them for as long as he could remember. What is he doing here? But he refused to let it shrink him, refused to let their narrow vision define the shape of his own life, because he knew what they could never see. He knew the nights Malcolm had spent reading to him when the world felt too big to face alone, the mornings when he woke to the smell of pancakes and the soft hum of an old record player spinning in the corner. He knew the quiet jokes and the shared silences, the small, steady ways that Malcolm had shown him what it meant to be brave, not in the loud, showy ways the world liked to celebrate, but in the quiet, persistent act of showing up every day, of choosing to stay even when it would have been easier to walk away. And in that knowing, Ethan found his own strength, his own quiet resolve to stand a little taller, to meet the world's gaze with the same calm certainty he had learned from his father. The Chancellor's voice rose again, the final notes of her speech ringing out in the stillness, and as the applause swelled around them, Ethan turned to Malcolm, his eyes bright with the unspoken truth that had carried them both to this moment. We are here. We belong. The ceremony's applause faded, replaced by the soft rustle of programs being set down, and the faint clink of glassware from the back of the room. For Ethan, the world seemed to narrow, each breath drawn with a deliberate care as he traced the lines of his father's face in the quiet moment that followed. Malcolm's eyes were steady, his posture unbowed, but Ethan knew the weight that settled across those broad shoulders, the history carried in every careful breath. He saw it in the faint scars on Malcolm's hands, the way his fingers absently rubbed against the worn edge of his jacket, a small, grounding motion that spoke volumes to the boy who had watched those hands build a home from nothing but patience and determination. Around them, the Crowleys shifted in their seats, their whispers a thin thread of tension that hummed just beneath the polished surface of the day. Ethan could feel it in the set of their jaws, the polite but distant smiles that never reached their eyes, and he felt a quiet defiance stir in his chest. He would not let their narrow gaze define him, would not let the weight of their judgment overshadow the bond that had carried him here. He remembered the nights when Malcolm had returned home long after the world had gone quiet, his uniform heavy with soot, his eyes weary but warm as he bent to ask Ethan about his day. He remembered the mornings when the smell of coffee filled their small kitchen, Malcolm's deep voice humming softly along with an old jazz record as he cooked breakfast with a kind of gentle focus that made the world feel safe and steady. Those memories were his anchor, the quiet heartbeat of a life built not on grand gestures but on the patient, persistent act of showing up, again and again, without complaint or expectation. And in that quiet, Ethan found his own strength, his own resolve to stand a little taller, to meet the world's gaze with the same calm certainty he had learned at his father's side. As the ceremony moved forward, each name called to the stage like a small victory snatched from the hands of history. Ethan found himself standing taller, drawing in breath after breath, laced with the unspoken weight of every moment that had led him here. His father's presence beside him was like a steady pulse in the room, quiet and unwavering, and each time Malcolm's deep brown eyes met his, Ethan felt the ground beneath him steady, the roar of uncertainty retreating like a tide. Around them, the Crowleys continued their polite performance of support, their soft applause measured and restrained, but Ethan could feel the thread of discomfort in the way their eyes slid over Malcolm's broad shoulders and found only the worn patches on his jacket, never the man himself. He remembered the times he had watched his father return home in the early hours of dawn, the weight of other people's lives etched into the lines of his face, the faint scent of smoke clinging to his skin no matter how many times he washed. There had been nights when he'd woken to the low rumble of Malcolm's voice on the phone, answering the call of an alarm even in retirement, volunteering to help train new recruits, to teach them how to run toward the flames instead of away. Those nights had taught Ethan that bravery was not always loud, that sometimes it was the soft, patient voice in the dark, the hand that reached out to steady another, even when no one else was watching. And he thought of the way Malcolm's broad hands would steady a trembling ladder or smooth back Ethan's hair when he was small and uncertain, the way he had turned every small moment of fear into an act of love that left no room for shame. Now, as the Chancellor's voice rose again, Ethan felt that same quiet strength rising in his chest, a warmth that pushed back against the cold edges of the Crowleys' stairs. He shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing Malcolm's, and, in that simple touch, he felt the echo of every unseen battle his father had fought. Not just the fires, but the slow-burning battles of dignity and pride in a world that too often tried to snuff out both. In the hush that followed the final name of the graduating class, Ethan knew that, whatever else this day might bring, he had already won something greater than any applause could offer. The knowledge that he carried the best parts of Malcolm within him, a quiet, unbreakable bond that no roomful of whispered judgments could ever unravel. The room held its breath as the Chancellor stepped forward once more, the microphone catching the light like a polished blade. Ethan felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the polite murmur of conversation stilled as the Chancellor's gaze swept over the crowd. Beside him, Malcolm's shoulders drew back just a fraction, the quiet readiness of a man who had spent a lifetime bracing for whatever the world might choose to throw at him. Ethan could feel the weight of it, the almost imperceptible tightening of muscle beneath the faded blazer, and he reached out, just a small movement, his hand brushing against his father's sleeve, a silent message that he was here, that he saw him, that he understood. The Chancellor's voice rose, each word deliberate, measured, and Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as she spoke of unseen sacrifices, of quiet strength that asked for no recognition but offered itself anyway, day after day. Around them, the Crowleys shifted uncomfortably, their carefully cultivated expressions faltering for a moment as the Chancellor's words cut through the practiced ease of their smiles. Ethan saw the flicker of confusion in his cousin's eyes, the quick glance exchanged between two aunts who had always seen Malcolm as an inconvenience, a shadow at the edge of their pristine world. But he stood a little taller, his hand still resting against his father's arm, a small but unyielding anchor in the quiet storm gathering in the air. He thought of the countless times Malcolm had stood in the shadows, his presence quiet but steady, the silent weight of his history carried like a hidden metal no one else could see. And as the Chancellor paused, her next words hanging in the air like a held breath, Ethan felt a surge of something fierce and unshakable rise in his chest. Because he knew what was coming, even if he didn't know the exact shape of it, he could feel it in the way Malcolm's jaw tightened, in the way the room itself seemed to lean forward, waiting. The Chancellor drew in a breath, and then she spoke the words that would change everything, a name, spoken clear and strong, echoing across the marble floor. Malcolm Brown. The sound of it struck the room like a bell, and for a moment, everything else fell away. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening on Malcolm's sleeve as his father's head lifted, eyes widening just a fraction, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had heard. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath, and Ethan saw the way the Crowleys froze, their expressions shifting from polite indifference to something sharp and disbelieving. But in that hush, in that single heartbeat of stunned silence, Ethan felt a light bloom in his chest, bright and fierce and uncontainable. Because whatever else this day had meant, whatever small humiliations and whispered slights had trailed in their wake, this moment was Malcolm's. And Ethan would stand beside him, proud and unbowed, as the world was finally forced to see the man he had always known to be a quiet hero. The name hung in the air like a prayer or a challenge, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan watched as Malcolm blinked once, twice, his eyes flickering with the faintest hint of disbelief before his jaw set, the quiet determination that had carried him through decades of storms settling into place. Ethan's own breath caught, his chest tightening with a swell of pride so fierce it almost hurt. Around them, the Crowleys sat frozen, their expressions a perfect tableau of shock and confusion, the polite masks they wore cracking at the edges as they struggled to process what had just been spoken aloud. It was as if the Chancellor's words had peeled back a layer of the world they had always believed to be unassailable, revealing a truth they had never bothered to see. The Chancellor's voice carried on, each word painting a picture of quiet courage, of sacrifice offered without expectation, of lives saved and burdens carried in the shadows of the fires he had fought. She spoke of the subway bombing years ago, of the chaos and fear that had swallowed the platform, and of the man who had run toward the smoke instead of away from it. Malcolm's eyes were steady, his shoulders square, but Ethan could see the faint tremor in his father's hand, the way he pressed his fingertips together to still the quiet shaking. And in that small human moment, Ethan saw not just the hero the Chancellor was describing, but the man who had stood in their kitchen at dawn, making pancakes and humming to an old record, the man who had knelt beside him when he scraped his knee and told him that pain was just another word for growing stronger. Around them, the applause began, hesitant at first, a few scattered claps that quickly grew into something louder, fuller, a rising tide of recognition that washed over them both. Ethan felt the sound of it in his bones, each clap a testament to the man who had never asked for any of this, who had never once sought the spotlight but had always deserved it. He rose to his feet, before he realized he was moving, his hand still resting against Malcolm's arm, as he added his own applause to the storm, his voice caught in his throat, but his heart shouting the truth he had always known, that this man was not just a father, not just a firefighter, but a quiet, unbreakable force of love and sacrifice. Malcolm turned slightly, his eyes meeting Ethan's for a fleeting moment, and in that look there was a lifetime of unspoken words, pride, love, and a kind of humility that had never needed the world's approval to know its own worth. And in that moment, Ethan knew that no matter what else might come, no matter how the Crowleys might whisper, no matter how the world might try to reduce him to the color of his skin or the worn edges of his jacket, this was the truth that would stand above it all, that his father was a hero, and that he was proud to be the son of such a man. The applause filled the hall like a rising tide, rolling over them in waves that seemed to wash away the silence that had clung to Malcolm for so many years. Ethan felt the sound of it in his chest, a thrum of recognition that seemed to vibrate in his bones, and as he looked around the room, he saw how the polite indifference of the Crowleys had begun to crack, their carefully composed expressions giving way to something else, something that looked like awe or maybe shame. Malcolm stood still at first, his broad shoulders square, his chin lifted just enough to meet the weight of the moment with quiet dignity. He had spent a lifetime stepping back, letting others take the credit for the battles he had fought and the lives he had saved. But in this moment, there was no place to hide. The light from the chandeliers caught in the faint lines of his face, turning the quiet strength etched there into something almost luminous. And Ethan thought he had never seen his father look so much like the hero he had always been. Malcolm took a breath, his hand rising to adjust the knot of his tie, an unconscious gesture, but one that spoke of the years he had spent navigating rooms like this, learning how to stand tall even when he was surrounded by people who saw only the color of his skin. Then, slowly, he began to walk forward, each step measured and unhurried, the calm, deliberate movements of a man who had learned long ago that his worth was not in the noise of the world, but in the quiet, unwavering way he chose to live. Ethan moved with him, his heart in his throat, and as they walked, he caught sight of the Crowleys rising to their feet one by one, their applause joining the rest of the room in a chorus of sound that left no space for doubt. In that moment, Ethan saw the truth of what they were witnessing, not just the story of a man who had run into fire, but the story of every quiet act of love and every moment of strength that had carried them both to this day. And, as Malcolm reached the stage, the Chancellor waiting with a plaque in her hands and a soft smile on her lips, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a quiet, fierce pride that had nothing to do with medals or recognition, and everything to do with the man who had always been his father, long before the world had ever thought to call him a hero. The applause had settled into a hushed, expectant quiet by the time Malcolm reached the stage, and Ethan felt his breath catch as his father paused at the edge of the wooden platform, his broad shoulders framed by the soft glow of the lights above. The Chancellor stepped forward, her voice gentle but strong as she extended the plaque, her words ringing clear in the silence. "Malcolm Brown, for your courage, your unwavering service, and the quiet, persistent strength that has touched more lives than you will ever know." Malcolm accepted the plaque with hands that were steady but humble, his eyes flickering for a moment with something Ethan recognized, an emotion too big for words, a mix of disbelief and quiet gratitude that seemed to settle around him like an old coat he had never expected to wear again. Ethan felt his chest tighten, his heart thudding with every breath as he watched his father stand there in the soft glow of the spotlight. A man who had never asked for recognition, but who had always deserved it. Malcolm's eyes swept the room, lingering for a heartbeat on the Crowleys, who sat stiff and silent now, their polite smiles replaced by something closer to discomfort, before finding Ethan's face in the crowd. And in that moment, Ethan saw everything. The long nights, the quiet sacrifices, the gentle, steadfast love that had never once wavered. Malcolm turned back to the microphone, his deep voice steady but soft, as he spoke the words that had lived in his heart for so long. "I didn't do what I did to be seen," he said, and Ethan saw the faint quirk of a smile at the corner of his father's mouth, a humility that had never been for show. "I did it because that's what it means to be a father, to stand where you're needed, even if no one sees you, even if they never know your name." The room was so quiet Ethan could hear the faint catch of someone's breath, the soft rustle of a program being set down. And in that stillness, his father's words echoed, a quiet testament to a life built not on accolades, but on the strength of love and the certainty of doing what was right. Ethan felt tears burn at the corners of his eyes, his vision blurring as Malcolm's voice settled around him like a promise, that quiet acts of courage mattered, that being there for someone, day after day, year after year, was the truest kind of heroism there was. And as the applause rose again, louder now, stronger, Ethan stood taller, his heart echoing with every word his father had spoken. As the applause rolled through the hall, Ethan watched the way his father's shoulders rose and fell, each breath measured as he stepped back from the microphone and let the weight of his words settle into the hush that followed. Malcolm stood there, framed by the soft golden light, the plaque in his hands catching the glow like a promise. And for a moment, Ethan saw him not as the man the world had tried so hard to overlook, but as the man he truly was, strong, steady, and unbreakable in the quiet way that mattered most. Around them, the Crowleys sat still and silent, their polite applause ringing hollow against the warmth that filled the room. Ethan could see it in their eyes, the way their carefully constructed illusions had begun to crack, the way their whispered doubts and hidden judgments had been washed away by the simple, undeniable truth of his father's strength. Malcolm turned then, his gaze sweeping the room once more before finding Ethan in the crowd. And in that look was everything Ethan had ever needed, the quiet pride, the gentle love, the unwavering belief that no matter what the world might see, he would always have a place beside his father. Ethan felt the tears slip free then, warm trails down his cheeks that he didn't bother to wipe away, because this moment was too big, too important to be diminished by shame. Around them, the applause softened into a low murmur of conversation, the sound of it like the slow exhale of a breath the whole room had been holding. And as Malcolm stepped down from the stage, his movements calm and unhurried, Ethan moved to meet him, his own steps steady as he closed the small distance between them. For a moment, there were no words, just the weight of everything they had shared and everything they had survived, the quiet understanding that bound them together more tightly than blood ever could. Then Malcolm reached for him, his hand warm and sure on Ethan's shoulder. And in that simple, grounding touch, Ethan felt the truth of everything his father had ever taught him. That heroism wasn't in the headlines or the bright lights, but in the quiet, everyday choice to stand up, to keep going, to love without question or condition. And as they turned together to face the rest of the room, Ethan knew that whatever else the world might say, whatever old ghosts still lingered in the corners of those polite smiles, he would carry this moment with him always, a beacon of quiet light in a world that too often forgot how brightly such simple love could burn. As Ethan and Malcolm walked back to their seats, a path opened before them through the crowd, a subtle shift in the room, an unspoken acknowledgement of the truth that had just been laid bare. Ethan could feel the eyes that followed them, not with the quiet disdain he had grown so accustomed to, but with something softer, something that felt like respect. The Crowleys still sat stiff-backed, their faces carefully neutral, but even they seemed smaller now, diminished by the weight of the moment they could no longer ignore. Malcolm's hand was steady on his shoulder, each step a quiet echo of every lesson he had ever taught Ethan, to stand tall, to move forward even when the world tried to make him small. Ethan could feel the warmth of that hand seep into his bones, a quiet strength that pushed back against the doubt that had once filled these same halls. Around them, the conversations had shifted, the bright, brittle laughter replaced by softer tones, words spoken with a kind of careful reverence that had never been there before. Ethan felt it wash over him, the quiet murmur of change, and he knew that whatever else this day had brought, it had given them this, the world forced to see what had always been there, the truth of a man who had spent his life in service to others, who had built a home out of nothing but love and the unwavering refusal to give up. As they reached their seats, Ethan saw the faint smile that tugged at the corners of Malcolm's mouth, the soft light in his eyes that told him more than words ever could. And in that small, quiet moment, Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, the weight of years of whispered slights and careful silences finally breaking apart beneath the truth of who his father was. Around them, the ceremony moved on, the chancellor's voice rising once more as the next name was called. But for Ethan, the world had shifted on its axis. He sat a little taller, his shoulders squared in a quiet echo of the man beside him, and he knew that no matter how many polite smiles still lingered in the corners of the room, they could never erase this moment. They could never take from him the knowledge that he was the son of a hero, that the quiet, steady love that had carried him here was stronger than any judgment or doubt. And as he looked around the room, as he met the eyes of those who had once looked past them, Ethan felt a quiet defiance rise in his chest, a promise to himself and to the man who had always believed in him, that he would never again let the world decide the measure of his worth. The ceremony moved on, the chancellor's words weaving through the hall like a soft current. But for Ethan, time had shifted. Each breath felt different, each small movement heavy with the quiet echo of what had just passed. He could feel the new weight of the air around him, the way the world seemed to lean in closer, no longer able to turn away from the man who had stood in the spotlight, not because he sought it, but because the truth had left no room for shadows. Beside him, Malcolm sat with his hands folded calmly in his lap, the plaque resting against his knee, a simple piece of glass and metal that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Ethan watched the way his father's thumb traced the edge of it, a small, absent motion that spoke of a lifetime of careful strength, of a man who knew how to hold something fragile without ever letting it break. And as he watched, he felt the familiar swell of pride that always rose in him when he looked at Malcolm, the quiet certainty that no matter how the world might measure worth, this man had always known what it truly meant to stand tall. Around them, the Crowleys shifted uncomfortably, their conversations hushed now, their smiles tight as they tried to find their footing in a room that had changed while they weren't looking. Ethan could see it in the flicker of their eyes, the small, telling movements of shoulders and hands as they tried to pretend that nothing had shifted, that the world they had built from polite superiority still held firm. But Ethan knew better. He knew that the truth had slipped through the cracks of their carefully constructed masks, that it had taken root in the quiet applause and the soft glances of those who had never seen Malcolm before this day. And he knew, too, that it was enough. He didn't need their approval, didn't need the measured praise that would come only when it was safe to offer it. What mattered was the warmth of his father's hand on his shoulder, the steady grounding weight of a love that had never needed to be spoken aloud to be understood. As they sat together, Ethan let his gaze drift over the room, the light catching on the gold tassels and the polished marble floor, and he felt a quiet peace settle in his chest. Whatever else this day might bring, he knew that they had already claimed something more valuable than any diploma or polite applause, the right to be seen as they truly were. And in that truth, in that small, powerful moment of recognition, Ethan felt the quiet, unshakable bond between them grow stronger still, a promise that no matter what the world might say, they would always walk forward together. The applause had long since faded, replaced by the low murmur of conversations and the soft clink of glassware as the reception began. But Ethan could still feel the echo of it in his chest, a quiet pulse of pride that would not be silenced. He watched as people began to rise from their seats, their movements slow and careful, as if they were still processing the weight of the moment that had settled over them like a soft, undeniable truth. Malcolm sat beside him, the plaque resting on his lap, his thumbs still brushing over the smooth surface in a small, absent motion that spoke of a lifetime of quiet strength. Ethan could see the faint smile at the corners of his father's mouth, the way his shoulders had relaxed just a fraction, and he felt his own breath steady in response. Around them, the Crowleys moved with the careful precision of people who had spent their lives mastering the art of polite avoidance. Ethan watched as they exchanged glances, quick, sharp flickers of discomfort that passed between them, like the last tremors of a storm they had never expected to weather. He could see the questions in their eyes, the way their carefully constructed certainty had begun to crack, and in that small, quiet moment, he felt a surge of something like defiance rise in his chest. Let them wonder, he thought. Let them feel the weight of the truth they had spent so long pretending wasn't there. Because in the end, it didn't matter whether they chose to see it now or not. What mattered was the way his father's hand felt on his shoulder, warm and steady, a quiet anchor in the shifting current of the room. They rose together then, Malcolm's hand firm against Ethan's back as they moved through the crowd, each step a quiet echo of the strength that had carried them both to this moment. As they walked, people turned to watch, some with soft, hesitant smiles, others with the quiet, contemplative expression of those who had just glimpsed something they could not name. Ethan felt the weight of those gazes, but he did not flinch. He met them with a calm, steady gaze of his own, his chin lifted in quiet pride, because he knew that in this small act of walking together, of standing side by side, they were rewriting the story the world had always tried to tell about them. And as they stepped out into the afternoon light, the warm glow of the sun washing over them like a benediction, Ethan knew that whatever came next, he would carry this day with him always. A beacon of quiet truth in a world too often content to look away. The afternoon light wrapped them in a warm, golden glow as they stepped out of the hall, the heavy doors closing softly behind them with a hush that felt almost reverent. Ethan could feel the shift in the air, the quiet that seemed to settle around them like a protective shell, shielding them from the muted conversations that still lingered behind those doors. Malcolm's hand rested lightly at his back, a simple, grounding touch that reminded Ethan of every night spent reading by lamplight, every early morning when the smell of coffee had meant the world was still turning, no matter how uncertain it might have felt. They walked together down the broad steps, each footfall a quiet echo of the years they had spent building a life that was stronger than the doubts and the sideways glances. Ethan could feel the weight of the plaque in his father's hand, the way it caught the light in flashes of silver and glass, a symbol of something the world had tried to deny, but that could no longer be ignored. Around them, a few people lingered, their gazes following them with a kind of hushed wonder. Some offered small, respectful nods. Others simply watched, their expressions soft with the kind of recognition that didn't need words. And in those quiet gestures, Ethan felt the slow unwinding of a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. He glanced at Malcolm, saw the way his father's eyes crinkled at the corners with a small, private smile, and he felt his own lips curve in response. They didn't need to speak. The weight of everything unspoken hung between them like a silent promise, a testament to the bond that had carried them through every moment of doubt, every whispered slight. As they reached the bottom of the steps, Ethan paused, his gaze drifting over the campus green that stretched out before them, the neat rows of trees and the broad sunlit paths that had once felt like a world he would never be allowed to claim. But today, standing here with his father, he saw it differently. He saw it as a place that had tried to turn them away and had failed, a place that now held a small piece of the truth they had carried with them all along. Malcolm shifted beside him, his hand tightening just slightly on Ethan's shoulder. And in that simple gesture, Ethan felt the quiet triumph of 1,000 small victories, a truth that shone brighter than any plaque or polished speech. And as they turned together to walk across the sunlit green, Ethan knew that no matter what the world might say tomorrow, today belonged to them. They walked together across the campus green, the late afternoon light turning the grass into a tapestry of gold and green, each blade catching the sun like a small promise of tomorrow. Ethan felt the slow, steady rhythm of his father's steps beside him, the quiet, certain presence that had always been his North Star, guiding him through every moment of doubt. Around them, the world moved on, the soft laughter of other graduates drifting through the warm air, the distant music of a campus band playing for the evening's festivities. But for Ethan, the only sound that mattered was the steady cadence of their footsteps, the quiet language of a bond that had never needed words. Malcolm carried the plaque loosely in one hand, as if it weighed nothing compared to the years he had spent carrying so much more. And in that simple, unhurried walk, Ethan saw the truth of everything his father had always been. A man who had never needed the world to tell him his worth, because he had always known it in the quiet acts of love and strength that had built their life together. They paused at the edge of the green, turning to look back at the stately columns of the auditorium, the place where everything had shifted in a single moment of truth spoken aloud. Ethan could feel the quiet weight of that moment still lingering in the air, a promise that would echo in every step he took from here on out. Malcolm looked at him then, his dark eyes warm and steady, and in that look, Ethan saw the quiet pride of a man who had never needed applause to know that he had done something good in the world. "You did well today," Malcolm said softly, his voice rough with emotion he didn't bother to hide. Ethan felt the words settle in his chest like an anchor, grounding him in the truth that no amount of polished speeches or whispered judgments could ever erase. "So did you, Dad," he replied, his voice a quiet echo of the pride he felt, of the love that had always been the truest part of them both. Malcolm's hand found his shoulder once more, warm and solid, and in that small, grounding touch, Ethan felt the legacy his father had built. one not of medals or titles, but of simple, unyielding love. And as they turned together to walk back toward the waiting car, the fading light casting their long shadows across the grass, Ethan knew that whatever the world might see when they looked at them, the truth would always be there in the quiet, steady steps of a father and son who had chosen, again and again, to walk forward together. As the sun dipped low and the echoes of that day began to fade, Ethan and his father walked together across the campus green, their shadows long and sure. In the soft glow of the evening light, there was no need for grand gestures or polished words. The quiet bond between them spoke louder than any applause ever could. This was their victory, a triumph not of titles or applause, but of quiet love and the simple, unwavering act of standing side by side. And as they left the hall behind them, the weight of judgment replaced by the glow of truth, they carried forward not just the memory of a single day, but the quiet, unbreakable knowledge that real heroes are often the ones who never ask to be seen. If this story has spoken to you, reminding you of the quiet heroes in your life, share it, let your thoughts be heard, and subscribe to join us for more stories that shine a light on the strength that too often goes unseen.